Well, hello. My name is Professor Sholomo Levy, and I'm recording this video today primarily for the benefit of my students at Northampton Community College. For the last few weeks, we've been studying the foundation of the American colonies and addressing in particular the issue of race in America. And this is an important topic, and although we've been reading a lot about it in the assigned chapters and essays and documents, and also I've been lecturing in class about these issues, I wanted to take an opportunity to make sure, as best I can, that students understand how important this moment in American history was. It is one of the defining moments of American history. It's one of the things that distinguishes the United States from, say, Great Britain or Canada or France or other nations, and that events happen, particularly in the United States in the early 1600s, that would define our history right up to the present. And we're living in a time of a lot of racial tension and conflicts. And as people try to understand and hopefully find solutions to our current problems, we often must look to the past to determine the origin and source of these problems. And so history is the record of how things changed over time. And so what was done in the past has consequences on the present. And maybe perhaps more encouragingly, what we do now in the present will have consequences and perhaps will shape the future. So let's look back at this particular moment in American history and try to understand what was happening and the specific choices and decisions that people made then that had such a profound impact on the rest of our history. What we learned in those early chapters is that the British were somewhat latecomers to Western exploration of North and South American continents. The Spanish had been here since 1492, and what we saw from the Spanish is that their approach and their experience with racial and ethnic diversity were different from what we'll see now here with the British. Also different, for that matter, from the Dutch and the French, who were also attempting to establish colonies in North America. This isn't the first time, actually, that Europeans had contact with people of African descent. That goes back to ancient antiquity, back to the Mediterranean world. In fact, when we call it the Mediterranean world, it's referred that way because that was the world according to them, not the planet as we know it now, but the world around the Mediterranean Sea, which is not an ocean. On one side of that sea is North Africa and the ancient civilizations, some of the earliest human civilizations of ancient Egypt, of the earliest human civilizations of the ancient Babylonians and Sumerians, and then the earliest, although much later, civilizations in Europe, starting with the Greeks and the Romans. For people of ancient antiquity, that was their world. And that was a world that was bordered and influenced by contact with Africa and African people. As a matter of fact, as we saw, one of the important things about the period of exploration in 1492 is that was the year that Ferdinand and Isabella, the King and Queen of Spain, had ascended the throne and had taken control of Spain back from the Moors, the people of North Africa who had ruled even parts of Europe up until 1492. So that was an important year for them. And as Europeans began to explore, trying to find trade routes, as we said, to Asia, which means, again, contact with African people, contact with Asian people, at least the products, explorers by land like Marco Polo, who had gone all the way to China, and Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan. And so they had contact with Asia, with Africa, and those people with Europeans. But something is going to change in the early 15th century. And what we see is that slavery and racism were not innate. That is, it wasn't natural necessarily in these people, and that the institutions of slavery and the ideology of race developed, if we want to call it developed, we could call it devolved, but it took place over a period of time, at least over a period of decades, and we might even argue over a period of centuries, but over a period of decades at least. What we saw in looking at that first document that I had you read, which was taken from Christopher Columbus's diaries, from his log on the ships on the voyage. He kept a log of everything that took place, and he describes the first time he saw Native American people. Thought he was near India. We know this is in the current day Bahamas, but his first descriptions, if you recall, in that log were fairly positive. He described them as being handsome people with good features and very friendly and willing to trade with them, even though they couldn't speak the same language. They spoke the universal language of trade. I have this, you have that. We could make a deal. But he also observed the power imbalance, that those people that he met did not have iron or steel weapons, iron of any kind. And he realized that militarily they were far superior to the natives that they met. And he made the observation, if we wanted to, we could rule this entire island and, quote, make the people do whatever we want. And so, again, the point that I'm making here is it was initially racial, didn't have an initial negative reaction to seeing Native Americans. Actually was somewhat positive as to their appearance and how they looked, but that imbalance in power made him realize that if they wanted to, they could exploit the local people. And indeed, that is what they would do. This brings us to the second document that I had you read, was the letter from the Catholic priest, Father Bartholomew de las Casas. He was with Columbus, and he was on these islands, particularly in Cuba, witnessing what the Spanish conquistadors were doing, the rampage that was taking place there among the Spanish in the, say what would be more accurately called the Caribbean. Despite all that brutality and enslavement, even Columbus brought back native people against their will back to Spain. And then as they tried to extract gold and silver from the native people and then forced them into agricultural production of sugarcane, they were enslaving the local people. But in addition to that, there was a great deal of assimilation, of intermarriage between the Spanish people, the indigenous people, the Tano Indians and others of South America, and as African people were brought over to replace the declining Native American population. It's interesting to note and important to note the primary reason why the native population was declining was not through all of these wars and the brutality and the killing, which was certainly horrific, but because of disease. The diseases that the Europeans brought over decimated the Native American populations on a genocidal level. Again, unintentional. They didn't know anything about germs, bacteria, or viruses. But the diseases that Europeans brought were highly contagious and fatal to native populations in ways that they were not to European populations. The reason I felt it was important to mention that is many of us now are living through a COVID, coronavirus pandemic. And so these pandemics are not new in American history and not new in human history, of yellow fever, of the bubonic plague that wiped out a third of the European population. And so we see the social, political, biological consequences of contact between human beings around the world. And so the Spanish in their experiment, although it was brutal and exploitative, their approach was to assimilate the local populations, much like the Borg, if you're a sci-fi fan, that we're going to take these people and we're going to make them like us into Spanish people. And this is why they spread their language, which is why most of South America speaks Spanish to this day, and why they brought their culture, their religion, language, manner of dress, which they introduced, some people might even say forced, onto the local people, but the effort was to make them like us and make them a part of us to a large extent. That is important and stands in stark contrast to the British. This is why it's not accurate to say what historians used to say generations ago, before the arrival of the white man or before Europeans came, as if they were all the same or they were all alike in their attitudes and behaviors. In fact, what we're seeing, what we're learning, is Spanish were very different, and they attempted to assimilate local populations into their culture. The British focused more on economic exploitation, again, much like the Spanish, but they valued segregation and social isolation from Native and African people whenever possible. This is why the whole story of Pocahontas is really so significant. The controversy there is that she is a Native American woman. And John Rolfe, not Captain Smith as in the movie, but John Rolfe in actual history, her relationship with John Rolfe is considered an interracial relationship. It is a taboo relationship because he's white and she's Native American. Whereas if that relationship had taken place anywhere in South America at this time, which they were taking place on such a large scale that we call this not only assimilation, but there were Spanish words for it, such as mulatto and mestizo, referring to relationships between white men and Native women, white men and African women. And over the centuries, it has affected the complexion of people from South America. But when these relationships took place in colonial America, they were frowned upon. They were considered taboo. So now when we come here to the British establishing their colony in Virginia, they were hoping to find gold quickly and go back to Europe and live as wealthy merchants. And when they discovered there was no gold, they found other products of value. And that product was tobacco. The reason I'm going over this in relation to talking about race in America is the essays that I had you read, particularly those by Oscar Mary Hanlon, Jonathan Winthrop, Peter Wood, and Robin Blackburn. Each of these experts articulated a theory about the origins of racism and slavery in America. Some of these authors argued that race was the motivating factor, or the primary factor behind it. The majority of the others, however, argued that economics. So this is a little bit of a chicken and egg question, and I asked you in your discussion last week to take a position in terms of which of these arguments do you find to be most persuasive, and what do you think about this issue. But these are the primary two schools of thought. Everyone recognizes that it is a combination of both, but the question is which had the most influence. Was it economic, the desire for profit by exploiting people and not paying them, or was it racial as the reason to do it, and then the economic exploitation coming later, but it primarily being race. And so when you look at it historically the way we do, we try to find answers based on behavior. Which came first? What did they say? What did they do at that time? And from my study of this period, it seems that the primary motive was economic. And when Virginia is established in 1607, and they began cultivating tobacco, which was the local plant, used tobacco in their rituals, and this product was brought back, and they realized it could be very profitable in Europe, which it was. But it was very labor intensive, and it's important for us to understand that for almost the first 100 years, Europeans relied on white indentured servants to grow that tobacco here in America, particularly in Virginia. They would bring large numbers of white workers over from England to America, and they will call indentured servants. This is different from being a slave, but it's also different from being a free person, or what we would normally think of as a normal immigrant today. They were not free to leave. They were not paid. They could be beaten, what they call punished or disciplined. And this was a requirement on their arrival in the United States until they paid off the debt that they owed. So the person who paid for their passage was owed a debt that they repaid through work or service. This contract, indentured servant contract, could be from any period of time from 3 years to 5 years to a maximum of 7 years. At the end of that time, these white indentured servants were entitled to their freedom, their liberty to leave and do whatever they want at this point, and also to be compensated with a certain amount of land. And this head right, or this amount of land, could be anywhere from 50 to 100 acres of land. And that's what they were supposed to be given as compensation. And this is the way things worked for those first few decades of the 1600s in Virginia and many of the other southern colonies. Now, in 1619, and this is an important year, we don't do a lot of dates in this course, but 1619 is an important year because in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, the first people of African descent arrive in the British colonies of North America. And although we know they were from Africa, they may have been captured and brought to America from Barbados, other places in the Caribbean, it may not be accurate to call them slaves. They are Africans, but the institution of slavery had not yet fully developed or come into being or into form. What we know from the historical record, and if you read my PowerPoint presentations for week number 2 and 3, particularly the presentations on the founding of the early American colonies, founding of America, and the second presentation on the early American colonies, I go to this in some detail as well as in the slide presentations. But what we know about these first Africans who arrived in 1619, which, by the way, is a year before the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts in 1620. So this is why I said this goes all the way back. There were Africans in America, in the British colonies, before the Pilgrims started arriving in Massachusetts. African people were here. And when they arrived in 1619, they were mostly treated like indentured servants, despite the fact that their skin was darker than Europeans, and Europeans recognized that. In most cases, they worked them for a period of years, much like they would work the white indentured servants, and then they were given their freedom and they were given land. What we know from the historical record, using the example of one of these early Africans by the name of Anthony Johnson. Now, we know that Anthony Johnson, that wasn't his name when he was captured in Angola and brought to the United States. So already, when he shows up in the historical record, this is a person who's originally from Africa, brought to the United States. He is given his freedom, and he is given his head right, his initial allotment of land of about 50 acres. He becomes very successful there in Virginia, and at its height acquires some 250 acres of land in Virginia, and he now has white and black indentured servants working for him. So this was a very fluid time in American history. Those early years and early decades, you have both white and black people doing the agricultural work of growing tobacco. The black indentured servants were being freed and given land. And one of the interesting things about Anthony Johnson is that he next appears in the court records of Virginia, where he is being sued by one of his indentured servants. And this is an African indentured servant also. His name was called Kesor. And Kesor argued before the court that he was entitled to his freedom so that he could now earn a living, that he could acquire a head right of his own, that is to get land or work for someone else, because his debt to Anthony Johnson had been paid. Anthony Johnson insisted before the court that Kesor was purchased and he should be allowed to own Kesor for the rest of his life, which is the definition of slavery. It is rather ironic that in this case both parties are black. Anthony Johnson is black, Kesor is black. Anthony Johnson had also come from Africa and was given his freedom and become very successful in the United States, rather in the colonial colonies of America, because it's before the American Revolution. And then he does not want to free later indentured servants from Africa who are coming over, but rather to keep them and own them for life. Now we know Anthony Johnson wasn't the only one to do this. The fact that he appears in the record means that this was becoming common practice, and then it would be put into law. And the law starting in the 1660s started to define slavery in America legally, that you have the right that you could actually do this. You can keep a person, not pay them, not compensate them, and never give them their freedom. Remember, slavery didn't exist in England. Slavery had existed in Europe in its antiquity. The ancient Greeks had slaves, the ancient Romans had slaves, and the word slavery refers to Slavic people of Europe. That's the etymology, origin of the word. Long before the word slave came to be used to describe Africans, it described Europeans. So they had a long history of slavery, and so we shouldn't imagine that Europeans were above slavery and they would never enslave other white people. In fact, for much of their ancient history, the slaves were white and the owners or masters were white. In Africa, the slaves were black and the owners were black. So David Bryan Davis has an excellent book called Slavery and Human Progress, where he points out that slavery existed all over the ancient world. So America is not unique in that regard either. But in most other historical cases, slavery was never racial, or rarely racial, so that the race of the slave and the race of the owner were the same. And what mattered was their status as slaves, not primarily their ethnic identity. So this will start to change in America, and so the British are both figuring it out and making it up as they go, and particularly how it will operate here in the British colonies, which is not how it took place in Great Britain. And this is another important distinction. Although the American colonies are British possessions until the time of the American Revolution, slavery does not exist in Great Britain the way it existed here in the United States, even though we were British colonies. And the British are benefiting financially from this trade because they own the islands and they own the colonies. So they're benefiting financially from slavery, but they do not have contact with people of African descent, and they do not have large numbers of slaves being brought to Europe. Again, that would be maybe a different lecture, and we could talk about that. It's an important case called the Somerset case, where that is tested in the British courts, and the British determine in their court system that slavery is not legal in Great Britain, although the slave trade is, and they would also abolish slavery even in their in their Caribbean islands by the 1840s, long before the United States would, after our Civil War. And so these first slave laws start to develop around 1660. These are called the slave codes. And what they say, as a series of laws, they define slavery legally, right? They define it by race so that only black people can be slaves, right? It defines a slave as that the slave will take the condition of his mother. Now, why is that important? Because during this period of time, you have large numbers of interracial relationships taking place. Even in this family, the Anthony Johnson family, he marries a woman named Mary, also from Africa, but they have a son, and their son marries a white woman. This was permissible in Virginia and in Maryland in the early 1600s. Later laws would be passed, part of these slave codes, called anti-miscegenation laws, making it illegal for interracial relationships, interracial marriages, to take place. And that would remain the law, by the way, into the 1950s in the United States. In a case called Levy versus the state of Virginia, which go all the way to the Supreme Court. So these laws began to appear in the 1660s and remain in place until the 1950s. One of the laws also stated that baptism would not affect the status of a slave. And that is, again, because in contrast to the Spanish, who partly justified their enslavement of native people on the grounds that these native people were heathens. They called them pagans. That is, that they were not Christians. And so therefore, they could be enslaved. Well, in the early American colonies, as African people assimilated to British culture and learned to speak English, they also adapted Christianity as their religion. And so therefore, if religion were a factor, that is, if they said, well, Christians could not own other Christians, then slavery could not have developed in the United States the way that it did. So that once African people, black people became Christians, then a Christian cannot own another Christian as a slave. So the laws are written to say, no, despite the fact that they became Christian, you can still own them and treat them as. Let's take a closer look at how these laws developed over time and came to define what it meant to be a slave in colonial America. Okay, so as you can see from this first graph, this shows population growth in the Virginia colony in the first century of its existence. Over here on the left, you can see when the colony was founded in 1607, just a few early settlers. And then as they began to cultivate tobacco, the population of the colony grows exponentially over the rest of the century, such that by the start of the 1700s, there are nearly 90,000 British settlers in Virginia. And these people are growing the tobacco. They plant it, they harvest it, they cure it, they export it. For almost 100 years, white people were growing tobacco in Virginia. As I said a moment ago, in 1619, the first Africans arrived. And when they arrive, the population is so small that it doesn't even show up on the graphs. By 1650, there are a few hundred. And by, again, the beginning of the 1700s, there are almost 20,000. But they're a fraction of the population of almost 90,000 white British indentured servants. And so what this chart shows us is that Africans were not initially used as the primary labor source for the cultivation of tobacco in the American South. Furthermore, what we know about this population of the first few hundred, as many of them, like Anthony Johnson, were given their freedom and began to acquire land and indentured servants of their own. As we're going to see, this is going to begin to change by the 1660s and 70s, and certainly by the 1680s, when the laws of slavery become more entrenched. And when that happens, the black population begins to grow even more rapidly. Now compare that to this chart. This shows the growth of the black population through the early part of the 1700s. And so you can see how this black population, which only a few hundred in the 1640s, a few thousand 20 years later, by 1780, that number had surpassed 500,000. And so this dramatic, not only rise and increase of the black population, but this represents a shift in the labor source of the American South, where they go from using white indentured servants to almost completely shifting over to African people who they will treat as slaves. No longer are they offering white immigrants head rights. That is, immigrants can still come to America, but there are no longer any incentives for them to come in terms of offering them land and being willing to pay their passage to get here. Those incentives are removed, and the preference and the choice will be to use Africans instead. So this is important for our understanding of what happened at this moment in American history, because it has profound consequences on the future. It seems to support the argument that this choice was primarily motivated by economics, not because they couldn't get white people to do the work, not because the work was too hard for Europeans and Africans were better suited to the hotter climate. All of that is bogus. This seems to be a choice that African labor is cheaper and it is abundant, and it also has another advantage that I'm going to explain now. Okay, and in this final slide, a chart that I created to try to map out how the laws that I've been referring to developed over time and to show them to you chronologically. And hopefully this gives you a better perspective of what's happening in America at this time. Drawing your attention to the chart, what I did in the left column is I listed the year of the offense. The second column shows the crime that was committed. The third column is the offender. And the final column is the punishment that was given. And so in the year 1630, you have a white man who is charged with a crime. And what was the crime? It was called sleeping with a black woman. And the punishment was, quote, whipping for, quote, defiling his body by lying with a Negro. And so this is what I referred to earlier in the presentation as anti-miscegenation laws. Laws that were designed and created to try to keep the races apart. Because assimilation was taking place, despite the prejudices that were so carefully documented in Winthrop Jordan's excellent book, White Over Black, where he talks about, arguing that race was the primary factor, that yes, indeed, they did have race consciousness, race awareness, and there was prejudice. But despite those prejudices, people formed friendships, a certain number of relationships and marriages still resulted, which is what often happens once people are together. Despite what they've been taught, their decisions are based on their actual experiences and contact with different people, both positive and negative. And so by the 1630s, which is fairly early, I mean within 10 to 15 years of Africans arriving, there are laws to try to prevent interracial relationships from occurring. And so in this case, a white man was whipped for lying with a Negro. Now there's something suspicious about this incident, although we have record evidence, therefore we know it took place. And we should be thinking, because we do know that that it was very common, particularly for masters, to rape their female slaves, both consensual relationships and forcing themselves on the women who were their captives. So if this was a fairly frequent occurrence, then the question we have to ask ourselves is, why was this man being whipped for doing what a lot of men were engaging in? And so what we suspect is it wasn't the sex. It was affirming a relationship with this woman, that he was probably living with her as his common law wife, acknowledging her as perhaps as his wife, raising children together. This is what the laws were intended to prevent. Not stopping sex, and certainly not stopping rape, because as you'll see further in the chart, that slaves had no rights. Not to freedom, not to liberty, not to their own bodies, not even to prevent rape or murder. So it's not really to protect the woman. This is to discourage relationships, meaningful relationships from occurring. And so he is whipped for defiling his body by acknowledging that relationship. If you look at the next telling law, this is an event that occurred 11 years later in 1641. And here you have a group of indentured servants and slaves who run away. And what is significant about this is that even indentured servants could run away, even if they signed a contract to work for 3 years, 5 years, maximum of 7 years. If after a period of time they decided, hey, I don't want to do this, I'm gonna leave. By doing that, I know I won't get my head right. I won't get the land that I was promised, but maybe it's not worth it. Maybe I could do something else. Maybe the conditions are horrible. Maybe I don't like the way I'm being treated. And so white indentured servants could and often did run away before the time of their servitude was completed. In this case, 2 white indentured servants and 1 black servant, and we know the name of the black servant, his name was John Punch. That was his name. They all attempted to run away, and they were all caught. When they were caught, they were all beaten. And for the white indentured servants, they had additional years added to their servitude, their indentured period of labor, as punishment for having run away. But for Jonathan Punch, the black indentured servant, his punishment was that he would remain an indentured servant for the rest of his life, which is the definition of slavery. And so we first start to see it occur by the 1640s as a punishment for having run away. But even white people who ran away weren't punished in the same way. They'd have additional years, but they weren't required to serve for the rest of their lives. But in this case, the black indentured servant was. So first, lifelong servitude starts as a punishment for a crime, as a punishment for having done something, as a punishment for breaking your contract. Later we'll see that lifelong servitude is a policy. As soon as black people arrive, even if they haven't done anything wrong, haven't broken any laws, they are required to be slaves for the rest of their lives. In this case, you have first as a punishment for having tried to escape. In 1669, and I just have 2 other examples, but I think it's making the point, you have a black slave now. He's not an indentured servant, he is considered a slave. And he is punished for disobeying his master. And I'm not clear what the actual offense was. It could have been attempting to run away, because once you have slavery established as law, there is no risk to the slave for trying to escape. If he escapes, he'll get his freedom. If he doesn't escape, he'll be brought back and he'll be a slave for life, but he's already a slave for life. So there's really no reason not to try to escape. So in this case, what happens to this slave is the punishment for disobeying his master is cutting off his toes. And that seems to be done to prevent him from running. So cutting off his toes also, affect their ability to walk and work. But we start to see these kind of punishments go into place to prevent slaves from running away, which means they didn't willingly accept this change of status. We saw in the case of Kesor, who actually went to court to try to get his freedom, saying, I should be freed, this is the tradition. And then they say, no, we're going to allow Anthony to own you for the rest of your life. Then you have some of these people who may have been brought over when this was still a transition period, tried to escape, and they would resist, and they would be severely punished. This level of punishment was something that you could not do before. As I said, you could discipline your indentured servants. Even the white ones could be beaten, but you could not cause permanent bodily injury, right? So you couldn't cut off an ear, cut off an arm, cut off body parts. That would be going too far up until this point. By the 1670s, we see laws permitting white masters to go as far as cutting off the toes of their African slaves. And then finally, 1607, we have a case of a white master who kills his slave. And as you can see here, the punishment for murdering a slave was no penalty. No penalty. So he kills his slave. Perhaps he was beating him, disciplining him, went too far, beat him to death. And the question is, what's going to happen to that white master? And the decision in 1707 was that he should suffer no penalty. The slave was his property, and therefore he had a right to do whatever he wanted with the life of that person. And so over the course of a century, we see the status, the legal status of black people in America go from people to property. From people to property. Even though they were black, even though they were African, in 1619, when the first Africans arrived, you couldn't just kill a black person. That would still be considered murder. But by the 1700s, they are no longer considered people, they are considered property. And so the laws in colonial America deny them their humanity and establish them as property. And this, as I said, did not happen overnight, but it was very consistent, very methodical, and it really shaped American history from this point forward. Because from this moment until the times that we're living in, black people are still fighting for their humanity, fighting for equal rights, fighting to make their lives matter. And this is to restore their humanity that had been denied and taken away at this point. So I wanted us to see this, and I'll ask a hypothetical question. What if history had been different? How might America be different today if different choices had been made? Think about that as we continue. Well, students, I hope that this presentation was helpful to you in explaining some important things about the origins of slavery and racism in America. I focused primarily on the early colony of Virginia, but most of what I said about Virginia was true for all of the original 13 colonies. Later in the course, we'll talk about free states and slave states as we approach the Civil War. But at this point, all of the slaves, Massachusetts is the first state to legalize slavery in terms of these laws that are developing in the 1600s. New York was a slave state. New Jersey was a slave state. Pennsylvania, established by William Penn as a Quaker, and they become some of the first abolitionists. But Pennsylvania was a slave state, and William Penn himself owned slaves. He did not stay here permanently in the colonies, but he wrote back to his overseer of his estate. And in that directive, he tells the overseer, use African slaves. They are cheaper than indentured servants. So again, the evidence is overwhelming that this was the primary motive for switching to African slaves. The one exception to what I just said about all the colonies being slave colonies, ironically and interestingly, is the colony of Georgia. I know we think of Georgia as a southern state, as a former Confederate state, a state that still has the Confederate flag in the state flag of Georgia to this day. But the history is that when Georgia was founded, and it was founded in 1732 by a man named James Oglethorpe. He was an interesting person. He was a kind of egalitarian who was very concerned about debtors' prisons in Great Britain, and he wanted a more egalitarian society, and he convinced King George to allow him to establish a colony, which is why it's called Georgia. But one of the interesting things about Georgia when it was founded in 1732 is that slavery was prohibited. That's right. Georgia was the first and only colony that prohibited slavery at its founding. Later, Vermont will want to claim to be the first free state when it became a state in 1777, but it wasn't one of the original 13 colonies, and it didn't have slavery ever to abolish it. But when Georgia was founded, slavery was prohibited. And by the 1750s, the people of Georgia demanded that they have the right to enslave Africans in order to compete with the surrounding states of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama. And they said all of these other colonies are using African labor, and if we have to pay white workers to do the same work, then we cannot be as profitable as they were using slaves. And so they relented and allowed Georgia to become a slave state, a slave colony like the other colonies. So again, that is very interesting and very enlightening because it allows us to ask a hypothetical question, which is, what if they had prohibited slavery from the beginning? What if other states had not allowed slavery? Then our history today would be very different. The event that I want to leave you with, because I think it really sums up the shift that took place during this period. This event occurred in 1676, and it was called Bacon's Rebellion. The date is easy to remember because 1676 is 100 years before the American Revolution of 1776. And 100 years before the American Revolution, there was an uprising in Virginia led by a man named Nathaniel Bacon, which is why it's called Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was a British subject who came to the colony of Virginia as an indentured servant. He worked his time, he got his freedom, he was given his land. The problem was he wanted more land. Often the best parcels of land were taken by the Virginia aristocracy, and the indentured servants got land that wasn't as good for farming, and they didn't get as much as the landed gentry. And so Nathaniel Bacon and others like him, they wanted more land. In addition, they wanted to have a say in the running of the colony of Virginia. Virginia had a legislature at that time called the House of Burgesses, and these were the people who ran the early colony of Virginia. And indentured servants like Nathaniel Bacon had no say in how the colony was run. So they wanted more land, and they wanted more say, and they wanted to have political rights in the colony of Virginia. And they led a rebellion, came very close to taking over the colony. The governor of Virginia had to flee in fear for a while, and then Nathaniel Bacon died during the uprising, and it faded out. But it taught the Virginia aristocracy two things. One, that if you continue to use white indentured servant, you have to share wealth with them in terms of land or money, and you also have to share political power with them. They will want rights, they will want to have a say in the running of the colony. And so these two things establish the difference between using white labor and African labor. If you use Africans as slaves, then you never have to pay them, you never have to share wealth with them. Also, Africans will never have rights, and you won't have to share power with them. And so this is why you see from 1676 on a shift away from using white indentured servants to using African slaves for those reasons. And this underlies the kind of origins of the problems that we have. Once you have slavery, then it's necessary to develop the ideology of racism. So slavery is created for its economic advantage, to be able to exploit people, to have them work without pay. But how do you justify that? And this is the difference between prejudice, which is a feeling, right, or an attitude, and racism. Racism is an ideology, and the ideology is designed to justify behavior. And the behavior that it justifies is the discrimination and the exploitation of a group of people. It allows people who engage in slavery to still think of themselves as moral people, as people who are fair and just, because ordinarily the system of slavery would be a contradiction of our values, of our principles, of our religious beliefs. And so racism as an ideology puts people outside of your normal standards of justice and fairness and equality. And the reason that is important to know the relationship and the difference between them is at the end of the course we get to the Civil War, which ends slavery as an institution, but it did not end racism. Obviously, as we're still living in this time with the legacy of racism. So racism as an ideology has to be dismantled, has to be challenged, has to be discredited. And so this is where we are today in American history. I certainly hope that you found this presentation useful. I invite you to engage in conversation and even debate with me and your classmates, both in our online discussion room and our chat room, to post your comments about this, to do your own research and share your findings and perspectives with each other. For those of us who are meeting physically in class, to challenge or question anything that I've said here and to reach your own conclusion on these matters. But I think if we all think about it, we will understand how the problems of the present have their roots in the past, and the choices and decisions that people made then have profound consequences on the present. To end on an optimistic note, if that is true, then what we do here in the present could have a profound impact on the future, and hopefully making the future of the United States and of the world a brighter and more equitable one than we inherited. Thank you for your attention. Take care and be well.